Jennifer Negon, thanks for being with us. Negon, we'll start with you. In recent years, there have been at least 2 chiefs from First Nations in Manitoba who've been charged with sex crimes against young kids. But how widespread is the issue in Indigenous communities?
During the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the most horrific stories that came out with regularity wasn't so much the people knew about the abuse of clergy, people who worked in the schools against young people. It was oftentimes the young people against young people abuse that was one of the most horrific things to hear. It's not something that's spoken about in our communities, but it's certainly evident because it was, where did we learn this abuse from? Simon Fraser University did a study just a couple years ago, and that study showed that approximately 50% of all Indigenous peoples interviewed, Indigenous females interviewed, had experienced abuse, sexual abuse in their lifetime. And for men, it was 1/3. The reality is that each one of us, if we have not experienced that abuse, are related to, live with, married to a person who has been abused. And the reality is that it is integrally a part of our lives and an integral part of our communities, and we have to talk about it. We can't have it silently in the shadows, so that what happens is these continual issues that bubble up when someone is found guilty of that abuse, or in this case, charged with that abuse. We have to believe survivors when they talk, and we also have to talk about this much more openly in the fact that many really abusive behaviors, sexually abusive behaviors, have become normalized in our communities as a result of colonialism.
Jennifer, an APTN investigation identified dozens of sexual abuse victims across First Nations and Treaty 3 territory in what survivors described as a silent epidemic. We found the sexual assault rate there 10 times higher in Treaty 3 First Nations than the national average. Do you think that those types of numbers could be applied in other areas across the country?
Unfortunately, I do. I think, you said the word silent epidemic, and I think as we open up the conversation more and allow survivors and people that are victims of abuse to speak out, I think we're going to hear more about it. And, it is an intergenerational thing. It's cycles. That's how it works. And yeah, I echo what was said earlier about how it's learned. And unfortunately, when you don't know any different, those cycles are just repeating themselves over and over again.
Negon, why is this something, as we said, the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, and how do we start opening up those conversations?
Here's a question. How do you talk about one of the most horrific acts of abuse if you're related to that person? If it's a person that you see every day in your community, if it's a person that carries tremendous power and make decisions on things like your housing, for example, or whether you get a job or whether you get funding to go to university, like, how do you talk about these things? Silence is an easier option, but it will take collectivity, meaning people coming together and believing one another and standing beside one another. And sometimes that involves what's often called calling out or bringing up people who perhaps want to deny that abuse or people who want to continue to control that power position. But most oftentimes in our communities, these are done very proactively through our ceremonies and through our circles. But particularly, it must be done in a way that in the end result is resulting in a better community, not a community based in violence and banishment, but in one thinking about retribution and restoration, thinking about the ways people can come together as a result of actions like this, which can be extremely hard, but that's the heavy lifting that it takes to be a part of a community.
Jennifer, your thoughts on the silence around this and how to open up those hard discussions?
I think number one, making sure that communities have the resources is incredibly important. People talking about it is one thing. There's obviously a distrust between First Nations and the RCMP. How do we bridge that gap to have the conversations with people in law enforcement? And also, what resources are available for when and if those conversations are opened? And then after the fact, the legal process has to take its course. What resources are available for people to be able to get help? But I think right now it's just making sure that people know that there's no shame in talking about what happened to you. And I know that there is a lot of people that carry that shame and guilt with them to talk about their experience.
Jennifer Negon, we'll have to leave it there. Difficult discussion this week. Thanks for being with us.
Any questions?
Thanks.